Recording in progress.
Welcome to the Village of Cottage Grove Budget Review Committee meeting on Tuesday, August 18th, 2026. This is a hybrid meeting taking place both virtually on Zoom with the link at the top of the agenda, in person at Village Hall, and live streamed and post-meeting streaming on our YouTube channel. It is 5:31, so I'll call the meeting to order. We have a quorum and the agenda was properly posted. So we'll move to public appearances, public's opportunity to speak. We don't have anyone in the room, but if there's anyone on Zoom that would like to give public comment, we can do that. I don't know why I'm looking at you. No one? Okay. Then we'll move on to discuss and consider the minutes of the Budget Review Committee meeting from June 24th, 2026. Those meeting minutes are linked in the agenda.
I'll make a motion to approve the June 24th, 26 Budget Review Committee minutes.
And I'll second.
All right, motion by Brittany, second by Heidi. Any discussion on the meeting minutes? Otherwise, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain? Motion carries. So number 5, the reason we're here is the review of the 2027 financial management plans. We have Harry from Ellers here, and we will go through the presentation and then discuss and consider recommendation to the village board.
Awesome. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. Harry Allen with Ellers. So tonight we're going to talk through kind of the first draft of the financial management plan, which is something the village does on an annual basis. This first slide is just going to give you a little bit of background on what the FMP is. So really what it is we look backwards for several years and then we project out forwards for 5 years for where the village is going overall. So looking at your revenues, your expenses, and then trying to project out where that tax rate might land over the next several years. It also evaluates compliance with the various state programs you have to be compliant with, so primarily levy limits. You'll see that highlighted several times throughout the presentation. And really, we start this process now so that it can serve as a really helpful tool as you start moving into the 27 budget. So every year, we just like to give you a quick update on where the rating landed. The village typically issues debt very early in the year, so going back to March of this year, we did have that update call with Standard & Poor's, and they did affirm the village's rating at that AA stable rating, so the same rating that you've had going back to 2017. No news here, but just think it's helpful to understand what some of your credit strengths and weaknesses are. So on the strength side, you do have really strong reserves, consistent budget performance, and the financial management plan you go through every year is highlighted by S&P as a really good framework for building proactive budgetary policies, looking out that 5-year window. Some of the credit weaknesses, you do have an elevated debt burden due to some infrastructure and facility expenditures you've taken under. And then S&P does provide some upside downside scenarios so you know what might trigger an upgrade or a downgrade into the future. Things that could raise your rating, really this is looking at your resident income, which you have no control over. But if that income does tick up in the future, it will put you more in line with higher rated peers and could lead to an upgrade. What could lower the rating? These are really the things that you do control directly. So that would be a deterioration of your reserves or if your debt burden should increase substantially. Those two financial metrics could put you into a downgrade territory. So just looking at where the FMP is, where your resident income is, I would expect more of the same for your rating here for the next several years. And then this slide is just giving you an idea of where your fund balance has been going back to 2020 through 2025. So you can see it's been pretty healthy, growing over the past couple of years. The percentages at the bottom here are looking at that general fund balance as compared to your total general fund expenses. So you can see in 24 there was a dip, but that dip is a little bit of a misnomer. Just there were some additional inspection costs related to Amazon in 24. So still really healthy fund balance throughout this entire period, and 25 being at almost 38% of your general fund expenses. So really strong fund balance here.
Yep, and so I just want to make note, so this is because this is what S&P looks at. Our fund balance policy is a percentage of budgeted expenditures. S&P will look at it based off of actual expenditures. So in this graph, to present some uniformity, in 2024 here, the effects of the revenue and offsetting expenditure was removed from the calculation to really show that more where we've been sitting at historically for the last several years for unrestricted fund balance. We've started to get to the point where we've taken care of some significant facility needs. There's been less variability or volatility in some of the market conditions. Still some exist. So there could be a recommendation in this budget process for our more significant drawdown to get closer in line with our actual policy. Obviously with best practice, utilizing reserves for one-time purchases, not padding or using to offset levy costs for operating costs as best practice. So as we kind of move further in this model and what may happen after budget review, when we have a better picture of final capital projects and a better picture on where the general fund's going to end up, as a recommendation of fund balance transfer to either our debt service fund, which is our Fund 300, which would further abate the levy used to support debt service payment, or to replenish some of our 410 legacy capital fund, which we're no longer levying resources or have not levied resources in that fund over the last couple of years. So as we've kind of drawn down from that fund, when we have opportunities for good budget performance, replenishing it through this method would be best.
So then I mentioned this already, but you'll see a lot of talk about levy limits throughout the presentation. So what are levy limits? I think this is always helpful to just remind everyone. So that's how you can grow your levy on an annual basis, is at a rate of net new construction. So what is net new construction? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's any new construction less demolition equals your net new construction figure. That's compared to the total value of the village, and that percentage is what you can grow your levy by on an annual basis. So that's really your baseline. From there, there are various adjustments you can claim that would either increase or decrease that allowable levy. So we'll talk through those later as to what's planned on the adjustment side. So just giving you a couple year recap here of where net new construction has been for the village. If we go back several years to the 23 levy for the 24 budget, you were at a 7% net new construction, pretty healthy. The next year, 4.3% and 5.3%. And then this last year at the Amazon facility coming online, substantially stronger net new construction figures at 24%. So what does that mean for your baseline levy, your levy limit restricted portion? That can grow by almost 710,000 this year. So really a substantial jump there on what your allowable levy is for the 27 budget. This sheet is giving you an idea of where we're projecting the TID out value. So that TID out value is all of the value not as incremental value within the village. So this is a value that is paying that property tax levy. So looking at where this has been, there was a pretty substantial jump up from last year to this year. So you're around 1.2 million supporting your 26 budget. the 27 budget will be more around 1.4 billion. So some of that is from closure of TID 7 or TID 5. Okay, closure of TID 5. And then on top of that, I believe you went through a revaluation, which probably had some impact on this as well. And then looking into the future, we've projected out that your TID out value will grow by 3% in the first year of the model and then 2.75% for all future years.
Yeah, I want to comment a little bit on the net new construction. So the net new construction projecting for kind of subsequent years, 3% and then 2.75% thereafter. Obviously, the more TID out equalized value that's on the tax roll, you need more net new construction to move the needle. So we've had over the last 4 years some pretty historic net new construction. Currently, no major commercial related projects ongoing. We're doing on average between, let's just say, 20 and 40 new single family homes. So that doesn't generate the level of net new construction that we've seen in prior models. We had used, I believe, 4.73% in every year in the model last year. But again, because we want to be conservative in this model and come back better than expected, we feel like a more conservative approach on estimated TID out growth is important, because as this group knows, TID in value, that value that's created stays within the district, and so and not assigned to the general property tax roll. And when we're evaluating what the tax rate's going to be, we don't want to count value that actually is not going to be used to mitigate the tax rate. As for your comment on the revaluation, and we'll see this in subsequent slides. Last year, we anticipated there to be a TID out value of approximately 1.56 billion. What this plan shows is something closer to a 1.47 billion. And what that simply means is there were economic conditions through both the revaluation and things that ended up us just having a less value than what was anticipated by about $996 million. So we'll have a conversation on what that means from a tax rate perspective and some things that we can do to make sure that we're managing that impact.
Within our model, we project both the revenue side and the expense side. And as you know, there's not a lot of opportunities as a local government to grow revenues in this state. So by and large, revenues are held flat year to year outside of a couple exceptions. So the shared revenue is now tied to that 1 penny state sales tax. So we've assumed that increases at a rate of 2% annually, that your transportation aids also increase at a rate of 2%. The special charges that you have for refuse and recycling, we've assumed a 2% increase there. Outside of that, we generally held anything that's non-levy flat year to year. And then really what we're doing for those future years to balance your budget is we're taking the levy and solving that to make your revenues match the expenses.
Yeah, and so I guess a perfect example of this, for 2026, when we did this plan, we estimated 2% increase for transportation aid. We actually saw a 15% increase. So what that ended up doing is that had a positive impact on what our final levy amount is. And so that is kind of a hybrid calculation of 3-year average expenditure combined with 6-year average expenditure, and there's a floor and a ceiling. And so while we can kind of do our best guess at where that's going to be, we don't necessarily know, compared to every other municipality in the state, what our expenditures for transportation related infrastructure was. So part of the reason why we did that prioritization plan is to make sure that we're doing what we can to maximize what we're getting in transportation aid. There are a lot of communities across the state that are actually seeing decreases in transportation aids simply because they're not reinvesting in the infrastructure. So this is the state's kind of incentive to make sure that each municipality has a buy-in for that. For the special charge for the garbage and recycling, that is a part of our fixed 10-year contract. So that's a revenue and an expense that washes out in the budget every year. So that would have no impact, either positive or negative, on any result, because that amount ultimately is not, doesn't touch the levy at all. In this projection, one of the more variability item is the pilot payment. So when we're looking at with the TID 5 closure and then the impact of other tax related changes, we went with a little bit more of a conservative approach for right now while we're kind of finalizing an estimated mill rate. We could see almost $90,000 more of revenue on that pilot payment in comparison to what is currently modeled. But just sharpening our pencils a little bit on before we actually model that and have to come back and say we're not actually going to get that. We wanted to use the more conservative number, and that number all the way through the planning period.
Then on the expense side of things, we go through and do a line item look at all of your prior revenues and expenses, and then we inflate those in different buckets depending on what generally that cost is. So commodities, any sort of consumption item is at a 2% increase year over year. Employee insurance at 5%. Insurance, so your property and liability, also at 5%. Any service that the village contracts for is at 2%, and then wages grown at 3%. So I know there are a ton of numbers on this slide. The top is your revenues broken down by general bucket, so you can see taxes is that top line item there. Then you have intergovernmental revenues and a variety of other revenues coming in under that. And then at the bottom of the page is your expenditures, so broken by general government, public safety by 4 different buckets: police, fire, EMS, and other. You have your public works cost, health and human services, and some other costs down here as well. So looking at the top line numbers here for budget of 2026, there was around 7.57 million of revenues budgeted, balanced with 7.57 million of expenditures, where we show you going into 2027 as a slight uptick, around $340,000 increase. So you can see that 7.9 million in revenues and 7.9 million in expenses. So that represents about a 12% increase in the levy from 2026 to 2027. And then future years, you can see are smaller jumps, more around 3 to 4% for the future year increases within this model.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight a couple bigger numbers from planning year 26 to planning year 27. Roughly of the increase, about 80,000. And this is why I kind of try to work with our partners, EMS, fire, department heads, to get kind of good rough numbers. So EMS is presenting a very high level preliminary budget on Thursday. That number was utilized to factor in what's presented in this model. So that's a roughly, in our model, about $80,000 increase from the prior year. There was also, and I mentioned this last year, with the paid per call for fire, we helped soften that first initial year blow by transferring some of the TID 5 closure surplus. So that kind of allowed that tax impact to flow over 2 years instead of having to absorb that entire tax impact in budget year 2026. And then there's some additional let's just call it roughly $25,000 to $35,000 for additional operating and insurance related costs for operation of the new eventually constructed police station. So those are the kind of major changes from the planning year. I do also want to highlight some challenges here, in the next couple of years. Last year, as part of the budget process, Fire had introduced the proposal to have a full-time chief in 2028, along with a full-time fire inspection individual. And so those are expenditures and revenues that have not been factored directly into this model for a couple of reasons. Right now, with where things are in the study and in just general management, getting a good understanding of who are those employees going to be, what are their benefits, so to be able to properly project what those costs would be in future years. That infrastructure takes a while to get in place. Additionally, if we would hire a full-time fire inspection, we would almost certainly change to a complete cost recovery model from a village perspective, where we would pass on the cost of the fire inspection services to the actual business owners completely. We're kind of in the interim in that step, but that would then prevent any of that additional cost to fall on the levy. Additionally, as this group's aware, there are some contracted revenue that could offset operating costs and levy costs, but ultimately those system agreements have not been discussed. We have other partners in part of this. So because there are so many variables in what that could look like, I just wanted to make sure this committee was aware of those kind of ongoing things and things that are going to be possibly factored into 2028 and after. And there wasn't an oversight because they're not in there. And then there'll be some more revisions to this document. And again, when we're recommending it to village board, there's some additional costs that have to come out of this related to the stormwater utility that was approved to move forward with by village board last night. So that will be some minor revisions in the plan compared to what exactly the village board will see on September 8th. So a lot of kind of variables in comparison to what prior years are. Again, revaluation was one of them. Obviously TID 5 closure is another one. Some service model delivery discussions with some ongoing studies that are going on. And obviously with the implementation of a new facility. So just wanted to be completely transparent on where we are in the process and some of the moving kind of scale here as we go through this rest of this process. I guess I want to just pause here on this slide specifically. We as staff, we got feedback a couple of years ago to break out public safety, just so it was more apparent on where exactly those costs are. Is this presented in this way with the cost separated still beneficial? Just kind of want to make sure we're meeting expectations for the breakdown here. I'm seeing heads nod. So, okay, then Harry, if you want to keep going.
Sure. So that was more the operational side of things, and now we're going to switch here and look at the capital side. So before we do that, it's important to understand where you are before we layer on where you might be going. So what this slide is showing you is your existing debt profile. On the left is your total payment for each of the years out in the future. And then moving to the right, you have some various abatement sources that are used as non-levy sources to buy down what needs to be levied for. So the idea here is you have a variety of TID projects, TID 5, 6, and 9. Some debt was issued for projects within those TIDs. Those are going to pay for their portion of those projects. Same with sewer and water. So that's why you see all those red numbers going to the right. Those are other sources coming in to pay that debt. Also, from your more recent debt issuances, you have some premium that is used to buy down the interest expense for the first couple of years of repayment. So where does that land you? Looking at 27, you're going to pay around $5.3 million in debt service, but around $2.9 million of that will be supported directly by the levy. So that translates to around a $2.47 equalized tax rate. So per 100,000 of value, looking at around $247 on the tax bill. Where are you going just based on your existing debt? There is an increase here for 2028. So going up around 400,000 to 3.3 million in 28, another step up in 2029 to 3.5 million, and then you start to see your existing debt step down a little bit in those future years. So these next couple of slides are going to look at the capital projects that are anticipated over this 5-year window. So these are broken out into a couple different schedules here. This first one is looking at what is anticipated to be supported by the levy, and then we'll look at your utilities here as well. So generally, this is broken down into a couple different buckets. Your top one is your vehicles and equipment. These have a shorter useful life to them, so we assume that those are repaid over a 5-year window. We're really showing about equal borrowings for vehicles and equipment for the next 5 years. Your baseline right around 1.1 million, ticking up a little bit from there, just with, I believe, an inflationary factor put on that one. Your next bucket is road, sidewalk, and trail maintenance. So you can see this one's a little more variable year to year, just depending on what projects are needed. So 27, lower at around 200,000 anticipated there, but then 2 million in 28, another step down to 200,000 in 29, 2030, around 2 million, and then 2031, right over 200,000. From there, there's the Vilas Road path connection to Backen Park, modeled in 2028. So that's a standalone project around 400,000 modeled for 28. Then there are some more significant road reconstruction projects. So there's Ollie Street reconstruction, South Main Street reconstruction, and then Commerce Park improvements. So you can see those modeled out with Commerce Park being a significant one out in 2031 of almost 2 million for that project. From there, there's some sidewalk and intersection projects further out in the planning window, some park improvements for a community park shelter, which is modeled in 2029 at right around 1 million. Then you have some facility projects, which include a municipal services building parking lot replacement. That's 200,000 in 2029. Bonnie Road Public Works roof replacement, 300,000 out in 2030. And then your biggest one on the sheet right now is that EMS and fire station, which is slotted for 2031 at an estimated cost of 8 million. And then at the very bottom is a new ladder truck, which is estimated 1.6 million in 2028. So you can see all of these projects are identified for general obligation debt funding. So you'll borrow the money and you'll repay that over a period of time between 5, 10, or 20 years for those really large facility projects.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. So just a couple really important things that kind of sometimes gets lost over the translation of time. A lot of the vehicles and equipment that we have last longer than 5 years. So in this model, we've chose to, in every instance, we try to aggressively, because we don't want to take out debt and then still be paying debt and the useful life of the equipment's not there. So we typically try to look at, from a repayment perspective, repaying the obligation. We try to mirror it up as closely with the life of the useful asset, but we actually try to keep it a little bit conservative from a reduction perspective. Furthermore, our gross cost related fund balance for capital expenditures that were Pleasant Springs funds may be used to offset some of the capital expenditures. There could be cash that the village chooses to use to help defray these costs. Again, what this model is intended to do is, worst case situation, if no other offsetting revenues came in the door, including grants and any of the other ones that I just mentioned, what would be the full obligation? So when we're looking at this, the only kind of deviation from the 5-year for vehicles and equipment obviously is the ladder truck. That is primarily because, at least historically, those vehicles are lasting 20 to 25 years. I believe that comes from the fire standards, and that will be discussed further on. That is a purchase that's already been committed to, so the village board and the town board both approved resolutions, I think almost 2 years ago now on that purchase. So we're just kind of waiting to take delivery on that. As we kind of talk about some of the kind of in general philosophy here, there's an EMS and fire station on here. That number actually is from last year. as may be discussed in future facility recommendations, there's a very real possibility that that project is brought forward earlier than what's in the plan. But at least what the initial conversations are is that's not going to actually be a substation at this time. It's going to be a remodel. And why that's important to kind of understand is it's not going to be that full cost. Now, we may ask budget review and or the board to do, after the conclusion of any studies or recommendations, to come back before we issue debt next year. For the sole purposes is, remember, S&P kind of looks at this as a roadmap. So if we're going to move forward a major capital expense, we want to make sure we have a story. We finished a study, we identified a need, and this is where we planned that expenditure. Kind of, if we're looking at things holistically, if I'm looking at kind of the soonest that I would recommend it, again, not looking at system needs, just from a financial perspective, I'm really looking at any improvement I would recommend. Obviously, it would be in the soft year here, which would be 2029. What that would allow for a couple things. You would do, obviously, any A&E in 2028. But there has been other discussions on how do we fund for a project of this scale or this need, whether that be, there still needs to be discussion on how the building's getting paid for. Are we interested in investigating impact fees for a station, kind of as we kind of discussed with the police station project? It's best to start those conversations prior to the actual project happening. And so we may have the information to proceed with investigating what that could look like. What becomes challenging in the joint model is, obviously, the village board can control any fee or things that they want to implement, but that doesn't mean that the district overall has to implement that policy. So, if we would move forward with an impact fee or other type of funding mechanism, and the town was like, well, we're not interested, or we don't feel like it's going to have a material impact, that's okay, because ultimately we're responsible for whatever share we are. The other thing that I will mention is the reason why we switched from every year doing that approximately $1 million roadway improvement was the cost of asphalt, the cost per linear foot is significantly, the greater scope of project, we can get better cost. It also helps from an administrative perspective on making sure that every other year, if we're doing a reconstruction one year and a milling and paving, it kind of makes sure there's no year where we're getting overwhelmed and not delivering on a communication perspective to our residents, and making sure that we're also aligning with what staff capacities are. Through the capital prioritization plan, there was feedback that may alter some of these intersection improvements, timing and yearing, based off of maybe these improvements are certain recommendations to come sooner rather than later. But the board was interested, based off of written responses, to undertake a possible study in 2027 to see, kind of get a true sense of urgency on certain intersections and where our levels of service are. That being said, this, for the financial management plan, this is really where in the past couple of years I've seen the most movement as far as recommendations. I know a big one is community park shelter has gone in and out of this project. Another project that was discussed when we finalized the financial management plan, the capital prioritization plan, was separating Fireman's Park from the shelter replacement from some asphalt improvements. And so kind of getting an understanding of the deteriorating asphalt out there and what improvements could be done, what short-term, more moderate improvements could be done to help improve accessibility there. Unfortunately, I don't have those numbers for budget review to look at, but it is something we were asked to try to get modeled in the as soon as possible. So with the intent of either maybe doing something in 2027 or 2028. From just a kind of a pavement perspective, obviously if you've been out there, there's a significant amount of pavement over there. So we also want to get, as part of this conversation, want to make sure that we're getting the stakeholders involved. So getting Monona Grove, because they have baseball games, the fire department is, because there may be, from a village perspective, there may be some efficiencies into reducing the amount of impervious surface and the path. But obviously, if you have to get equipment in first responding vehicles, that has a significant impact. So that was part of our struggle on getting you a concrete number. The width, the path of the path, and things like that have a significant impact. And so we are refining what those prices are going to be, and that will be ready in totality for the village board to consider. We're not anticipating it to be significant to have a material impact on tax rate in any given year. Oh, fun. What?
Yeah, we're going to take a short recess and then for weather-related issues, we'll be back. I hope mine does. Although stay away from my roof.
I should have closed the sunroof. I mean, it's not open, it's not raining inside, but if the window breaks, then it will be. Yeah, I mean, the water would get in every.
So, this is where we're gonna go, this is where we're gonna stay, I'm rolling this.
Right, maybe not.
All right, so we are going to be actively monitoring the weather that's going on right now. Should we go into an official declared warning, we'll again pause the meeting.
I don't think
Oh,
anyone's hearing us 'cause we're muted.
all right. I just want to make sure. So again, we're going to be actively monitoring the storm active warning, we'll pause the meeting again. Paul, I see your hand up. Are you good to continue at this time?
Yeah, I just had some questions.
Okay. Yeah, I think now is
Well-
a good time.
Yeah, no, and I tried to kind of get a while back, so I apologize if I'm going backwards. So when we looked at the capital prioritization list, and specifically that the first one that talks about vehicles, roadways, and such. I noticed there's nothing in there for ambulance replacement, and I don't know I know when I was on the commission that generally we were rotating them about every 3 years. Is it anticipated that that's going to be cash funded through EMS through run fees?
So to answer your question, that number, so if you look at kind of a couple things, on the 1,077,000, that is regardless, the ladder truck's a little bit unique because of its pure dollar amount. So that was pulled out of vehicles. The full cost of what our ambulance portion, which was projected to be roughly 88,000, is in the detailed list for the vehicle budget. It is unlikely, again, at least the way that it's presented, that we're going to actually have to borrow for that cost. But again, it doesn't. I've kind of took the philosophy on all-in vehicle, so it doesn't matter if reserves are paying for it or if debt's paying for it. The kind of overall budget for vehicles at any given time is that 1 million, in this case 77,000. Does that make sense?
It does. And then, at the beginning you talked about 700,000, right, coming onto the levy. So I just want to understand, is that, for instance, could that 700,000 be used to not have to borrow as much in 2027? What is the plan for that?
So what we would do, and I guess making sure that we're separating the kind of the actual final levy with what we would do in practice on the levy limit worksheet. So in order to maintain our base levy, which is the number that gets multiplied by the net new construction, we would reduce our adjustment on the levy limit worksheet for debt service, which exceeds that dollar amount. So I think we're all, when everybody kind of looks at this, and the 700,000 actually is made worse by the TID adjustment. I think the total is $1.2 million technically after adjustments. We would only levy the additional funds that are needed to recover, but we are still not where a community would utilize money to borrow less and levy for capital funded is if you weren't taking that debt adjustment on your levy limit worksheet, where you would still want to utilize your full your full property tax levy, but then you would allocate a certain portion of that for capital expenditures.
Yeah, so another question, with the creation of the stormwater utility, you mentioned about 145,000 will come off the levy because that'll go into a user fee. So what happens to that 145,000? Does it go back to the residents? But where does it go?
Yep. So we have to take. So the state is very clear on the adjustment that we have to take for this. So we have to go back and look at what was levied for that service in 2014 and reduce our allowable levy by that dollar amount. And so what that ends up doing is there's no surplus funds to give back. Again, we would at the end of the day only levied what was needed to fund current operations.
Okay. And you said 2014.
Yep.
Okay.
Hopefully that was helpful. And so really the key here, if we, and I think maybe, Paula, let's talk about this a little bit more when we get to page 20. I think
sure.
we can kind of show what that looks like in reality when you're talking about the actual filling out the worksheet.
Perfect, thank you.
Do you have capital or other operating questions you want to discuss?
No, not right now.
All right, perfect.
Awesome. So these next two slides I'm going to go through a little bit quicker. These are your water and sewer projects. So they really only flow through the model impacting your debt limit. They don't really have a direct impact on where your levy is going, but they're a part of your overall financial picture. So it's important to understand what is hanging out there. A quick note on these two. In prior years, we've done a variation of showing revenue debt or geo debt, maybe a blend, maybe all of one or all of the other. When we look at the current projects that the village has planned and where your value is overall, we actually show you can fund all of your planned utility projects on a general obligation basis, which is good news. That's your lowest cost of borrowing overall. You don't have to fund a reserve fund. Overall, it just cuts down expense for the village. So that is a good update to the model this year, that you can do all of that on a general obligation basis. So just going through some of these projects at a really high level, you have some projects at the top here related to the plant, which are really going to be cash funded by the utility. And then your larger projects at the pumping plant, as well as transmission and distribution, those will be debt funded. So looking into the future, that's around $2.5 million of debt funded projects for 27, 1.3 million in 28, and then dropping down from there with a slight increase out in 2031. And then at the bottom of the sheet, there are also some projects that aren't necessarily built into the model because they're intended to be funded by impact fees. So that's a new well, as well as Coil South upsizing.
Yeah, and I guess I want to highlight, especially on the water side, there's a couple projects in here that are redundancy based. So similar to what we did this year with the Gaston water main looping, we have the South Grove improvement looping. Some of the intersection work improves some of the flow as well. Really, the start of kind of a major cash funding on some projects. So there's going to be a mass meter replacement starting in 2031. There'll be 3 consecutive years of almost $175,000 of cash funded meter replacement. And then there will be further, if we're kind of going further out on this model, eventual water tower painting, which unfortunately is not considered a capital expenditure. From a pure accounting perspective, it's considered maintenance, but it ends up being, $300,000-$400,000 a tower. So significant impact. Yeah, we can go over sewer.
Perfect. So sewer side, a little bit less going on this front. So that top line would be your cash funded projects of just your fleet cost on an annual basis, around 40,000. And then at the bottom is another cash funded project for the Ridge lift station. In between there, you have your debt funded projects, which there's a sewer lining, some main work, some other reconstruction and urbanization, as well as a lift station that needs some work. So 27, around 1.4 million of projects, and then dropping down into the future. And then much like the water side, there are also impact fees here for sewer. So that would be for the Ridge lift station out in 2031.
And with the sewer too, I guess this makes sense that it's less because we don't own our own treatment plant. So when we're looking at a capital stack that's reduced, kind of compared to what you're seeing on the water side, we don't have the $120 million treatment plant that would be roughly needed to serve our community. That's where roughly about 52% of the operating budget goes to paying MMSD for those conditions. We do have obviously projects like the lining projects that we're trying to extend the life of all of our infrastructure, making sure that we're not getting infiltration issues. And Kylie knows all the technical terms, but some of this stuff is making sure that ideally, a lot of this infrastructure lasts about 50 years. And so that's 1 mill and overlay. By the time you get to the second mill and overlay, you should expect to have to replace the water and sewer infrastructure under the ground. We have no lead in any of our and kind of going back to the water. So we're not having to proactively replace kind of material that causes that may cause issues. It's also important to know that these are going to become much more frequent in 10, 15 years if we're talking about the total mileage of piping. So it's just kind of important to understand that here in the future models that we should start to get kind of more familiar with true reconstruction projects as we go down. The one positive it would be is you may see more reconstruction projects and maybe less mill and overlay because you're just doing more mileage of road. It's just falling into reconstruction as opposed to mill and overlay. On the sewer utility, kind of just a high level note, there are some relatively significant increases that are going to be passed on. There's a community member meeting on August 20th that village representatives plan on going to. But just to kind of keep this body update that we are going to start getting some communication out regarding kind of some things that are outside of our control from a sewer perspective.
So wrapping up all of the debt side of things, this is just giving you an idea of where those future issuances are estimated at. So this does include your levy supported as well as your water and sewer supported projects. So looking at 2027, around 6.6 million of debt, 7.3 million in 28, dropping down to 3.3 million in 29, 4.4 million in 2030, and then 2031 being elevated with the fire station in there as well as some other utility projects. So around 20 million out in 2031. And then we've also highlighted the interest rates that we use here on the right. I would say there's a lot of cushion built into these, and that's just another area in the model where we make it really conservative, try to give you the worst case scenario. If we look at where debt currently is, it's more around 4% for 20-year debt, so there is quite a bit of cushion within these rates. And then looking into the future as to how your debt is allocated. So there's 3 different colors on here, the orange being your levy debt, the blue being your TID debt, and then the green being your utility debt. So you can see the levy debt really is expected to grow here as a proportion of your overall debt. The biggest change here is your TID debt will be shrinking rather rapidly. By the end of this planning period, you're really looking at around 10% of your overall debt profile being TID, with the majority being levy. And even with those utility projects that we talked about being funded on the general obligation basis, you can see they're consistently staying under 20% of your overall debt profile.
Yeah, and kind of this paints a key picture here. So TID 5 was a unique TID in the aspect where the village did a lot of the infrastructure up front, took out debt, and obviously repaid it with the increment. TID 8, 9, and 10 currently don't have infrastructure being put in, at least initially, which we would have to fund with debt unless the developer did it and we paid the developer for that infrastructure being put in. That being said, we really aggressively pushed the GO repayment of the land acquisitions in TID 9. So where obviously, you typically would fund a larger purchase like that over 10, whatever years, we funded almost that $4.9 million purchase over like 6 years because that's how fast we were recovering the increment. So out of this chart, the biggest variability that you may see is if there's other acquisitions that may come. If we look at this chart again next year, you may see a little bit of a bigger percentage on the TID perspective if there's additional acquisitions or other projects that the board moves forward with. I do think also this is where it becomes very challenging, especially when we're comparing to other communities. In a lot of other communities, the utility acts very separate, almost exclusively separate from the village board and activities. Where that shows most often is even if a community has the ability to issue GO debt, they choose not to because then it doesn't factor into their general obligation debt percentage. So there are communities out there where their geo debt percentage is low, but they have a huge amount of revenue debt. We'll have most of our revenue debt, I believe, paid off by 2031, which will be unique for a community our size to only be relying on general obligation debt. And again, helps us in two factors, decrease interest rate, but then we're also not required to have as significant of a reserve balance for future debt payments in that aspect.
So this slide has a ton going on, but this is carrying over. The numbers on the left are carried over from that base case that we walked through previously, which is your existing debt. And all we're doing, moving to the right in those orange columns, is layering in the new debt issues. So that 5 years of additional debt issues based on the term and structure and rates that we talked through on those previous slides. And then you'll see some negative numbers further to the right. That's where we're backing out that new water and sewer apportion debt. So this is really projecting out where we see that debt levy going overall. So the most important columns are really all the way over to the right here. So you can see in 2027, there's that 2.9 million debt levy. That's the same number we talked through on your existing debt. And then we saw some upticks just based on your existing debt previously. With the new debt layered on, those upticks are a little bit higher now. So looking from 27 to 28, we do expect an increase of around 740,000 up to around a 3.7 million debt levy. And then really leveling out that increase over the planning period to the tune of around an $800,000 levy increase per year until you hit the end of the planning period with your 2032 debt payment being at 6.9 million, which per 100,000 of value would be around $363 in taxes. So it's about a $160 increase from where we're projecting for 2027. And then looking at your general obligation debt capacity, so you are limited by the state to having no more than 5% of your total equalized value outstanding at any time as general obligation debt principal. So this is where we get to kind of that push-pull of where we would look at revenue or general obligation debt. This is the schedule that really determines where our recommendation would be on that front. So what we're seeing here is even with all those utility projects done on a general obligation basis, you're really seeing no change or an improvement overall in your utilization of the debt capacity with all these projects layered in. So yeah, and your projected end here, 2026, using just shy of 50%. And by the end of the planning period, even with some significant capital projects, we are modeling out that you'd still be under 50%, around 48%. So a slight improvement on that front. So looking really healthy with the amount of debt that's being planned here. And then this is really wrapping everything in full picture. So taking that operating side, taking the debt side, layering everything together and giving you that full picture look at your total property tax levy and your associated tax impact. So just reminding you of where 2026 was. Overall, you had a $6.5 million levy, and that translated to a tax rate of $5.49. We are showing here with the 2027 budget a pretty substantial increase in the levy, up to around 8.2 million. So that's a 25% increase in your levy, but the tax rate that we're projecting is only $5.72. So it is an increase in the tax rate, but because of that really large growth in value you had, particularly from the closure of the tax increment district, you are seeing an ability to increase your levy quite a bit and see a really minimal tax impact from doing so. And then future years are modeled at around a 11 to 12% increase in the levy, so that translates to around $30 per year on the increases there.
Yeah, so again, kind of back to a comment I had mentioned earlier. If you took the financial management plan that was approved, property tax levy, we were roughly within $18,000 of what we projected at last year at this time. One of the big key changer was, we were about $96 million less in TID out equalized value. And why that's important is obviously that has a relatively significant impact on the overall tax rate. There is work to be done on 2027. When I looked at this, I saw that immediately. It's one thing to project expenditures, but obviously if your equalized value does not increase on what you expected to do, we need to get back into alignment, back into expectations, at least from a planning perspective. So definitely some work that can be done for future years. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of impacts on possible service model updates or full-time staffing discussions. When we're looking at this kind of overall and kind of what we would ask this group to do tonight is kind of set general, recommendation to the village board, as well as any possible changes. Primarily focused, I would say, between 27 and 29. Recommendations in 2030 and between 2030 and 2032 are good, but a lot of things could change before then. We were very kind of conservative on. So we have some large projects that are going to be coming on that are outside of TID districts. Heyday is one of them. We had a little bit less value than anticipated coming this year, but that just means we're going to make up that value next year. And obviously there's various residential neighborhoods, but we felt like this was a very conservative approach to present it this way. So maybe before we could do questions, we hit the next page. And if you kind of want to just talk about high level, the debt adjustment.
Yeah. So I'm going to start tackling this slide just by what happened for your 26 budget and just explain kind of the moving parts, and then we'll look at what we're seeing here for 2027. So on the left is just recreating what your levy limit worksheet was. It got filed late last year. So working top down, it takes your prior year's actual levy. So this is now looking at your 24 for 25 levy at $6,180,519. It deducts out your 1 year debt adjustment. So that's kind of temporary levy authority that you're allowed under state statute. We'll talk more on that when we get to the 27. But that gets you to a levy limit restricted levy of $2,721,830. From there, you have your net new construction allowance. So for the prior year, that allowance was 5.3%. That's what you were able to grow that base levy by. So on a dollars basis, that was $144,000 of increase. That all gets added together. It deducts out what your personal property aid payment is for the following year, and you get an unadjusted allowable levy of $2,832,450. Your actual levy is substantially larger, so how do you get there? You get there by claiming a adjustment E. So this is your adjustment for general obligation debt service. It is restricted at your total general obligation debt service payment for the following year. So if you recall going through that base case schedule where we looked at the left side column, that is what that adjustment is restricted at. So if you have abated debt, you could claim an adjustment for those negative numbers we saw if you should need to. But really where our recommendation is that number on the right, your net levy, that really gets considered your maximum adjustment E, which I know the village has claimed higher at points in the past. But looking at the 26 budget, you did claim a debt adjustment of $3,680,076. You add that to your levy limit restricted levy. That's how you got to your levy within your budget of that $6.5 million. So now looking at where we're going here for the 27 budget, that prior levy gets carried forward. That shows up at the top of your form, and then they deduct out what that adjustment E was last year. And then this year's form has an extra thing that's happening, and that is because you did close tax increment district number 5. So the state does give you an additional levy limit bump in the year following a tax increment district closure. And just given the size of TID 5, that is a really substantial one-year adjustment. It's almost 11% that you get to claim in the year following the closure. So on a dollars basis, that is adding around 311,000 of levy capacity for 2027. So a really substantial figure there from closing your TID. And that's before we account for that 24% allowance of net new construction. So that 24% allowance is allowing that 686,000 of levy growth. When you add those together, you have almost $1 million in one-time levy growth that goes right into that base levy and will continue to get net new construction into the future. So those are really, really substantial numbers especially for a community of this size. From there, you get down to now your levy limit restricted. Levy is 3.82 million, so a full $1 million higher from where you were last year. And then to get up to your total levy that we were showing in those previous schedules, you do still need to claim a debt adjustment. So that's where that 4.2 million figure is that's shown on here. And I know that number is slightly shorted in this schedule. It should be more like 4.3 million. We'll correct that for the village board schedule. But ultimately that gets you to your allowable levy at the bottom of that 8,168,499. No, that was a lot of information. But the idea here is that the big takeaways, your limit restricted levy is seeing substantial growth this year, but you still need to claim a GO debt adjustment, and your GO debt adjustment that you need to claim is in line with your existing debt profile, so you can claim the levy that you are looking to need for the 2027 budget. Any questions on this one? I know it's a lot of information.
Paul, I know you had a question on that. I just want to make sure you got your question answered there.
I believe so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, of course. You could finish the 2 slide and then I have one other thing.
Do you want me to mention the stormwater adjustment here?
Yeah, I mean, yep.
So if a stormwater utility is created, that is a covered service. So you would need to take a negative adjustment on the levy limit worksheet. So that would show up here. We actually have it in the schedule. That's adjustment Q. So when we do put this in front of village board, we'll likely update that to show you what that negative adjustment would be for your levy. So your levy ability will likely be a little bit lower, or you could supplement that by increasing your debt adjustment. And then the schedule is looking at your tax levy and tax rate and just giving you a visual representation of where it's going into the future. Apologies, as it is cut off on the right. The axis doesn't go up high enough. Your total levy does go up to around 13.3 million, cuts off at 12 million. So those bars on the right should continue to go up a little bit. But this is just giving you an idea of where we are seeing some tax rate increases coming, but generally level year over year. Anything you wanted to highlight here, Cam? And then just a high-level overview of your tax increment districts here. So you do have 4 tax increment districts open. I'll just go through each of these. TID number 6, that has around $3 million in incremental value as of January 1 of this year. It does partially support its debt. There is anticipated support from the village's general fund to make up the kind of the shortfalls that we're seeing within tax increment district number 6. And we're expecting that one will remain open until 2031. TID number 8 has 4.3 million in incremental value. The final increment collection on this one is out in 2039, and it does have existing PAYGO incentives in place. TID number 9, that's sitting just shy of 50 million in incremental value. Final collection is also out in 2039, and this one does have debt assigned to it for some land acquisition. So you saw that within the base case model. Then TID number 10, that's your big one. That's where Amazon is at. So north of 400 million in incremental value in that one right now. Final year of increment out in 2039, and this does have some significant PAYGO incentives in place within it. And then just a couple highlights here. The average levy change per year over really the 6 years that we're looking at is just north of 12%. Not necessarily leveled out through every year, but 12% is the average overall. And then the average equalized tax rate over the 6 years is $6.39 per thousand of value. And then the maximum geo debt capacity is really this year at 49.77%. Even with those additional projects layered in, we expect that debt capacity to go down into the future. So, with that, I'll turn it back to you, Cam.
Yeah, Harry, I just have one thing to share, which was requested of us. So I'm going to replace you. Okay, so this is kind of more back on the operating expense perspective. So we're working on doing the professional service provider reviews at the village board related. There was some interest to kind of see how these cost. So we kind of talked about, okay, what are we doing from a service model perspective, whether it's in-house or if it's continue to utilize a provider. So I put a chart in together here for this group to take a look at. What I want to make sure is what this chart does not show is any costs that are passed through a developer through ongoing projects. So the three kind of funds that I have shown here is the general fund, the water and sewer, more or less as an FYI, because they are kind of supporting the ongoing operations. Additionally, major projects. So like if there's a significant kind of like one-time project, this is just kind of the cost to continue budget. And this is what kind of annually, regardless of what's going on, is in the budget. So the revaluation last year was, this is why we don't do this every year. That was 126,500. So obviously in 2026, we're just having a maintenance year of the 32,500. So you'll see a relatively significant decrease. A lot of the other charges stay flat. Building inspection, the way that we have our building inspections set up is we issue a permit. The cost of the permit is obviously passed through to the person pulling the permit. So none of that resources is used to levy. There is a cushion between what the permit is and what the cost is, and that's to help cover ongoing records, because all of these records are permanent records, meaning we have to keep these forever. So that's factored into the overall cost of the permit. These obviously are not an all-exclusive list. There's many smaller, significantly smaller costs, but these are the historically some of the groups that have presented to village board. I am done.
Hi. Open it up to questions on the presentation and what Cameron covered, and then I think there are a couple of things that we need to discuss to give our feedback to the village board. So I guess, does anyone have any questions on the presentation? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Paula.
So, is there anything we can do within our routine maintenance where we're borrowing for those? Are there, I don't know, other annual revenues or a dedicated capital replacement program or something that when we're doing these routine maintenance, we're not having to borrow for it?
Yep. So we've kind of drawn the line at routine maintenance being anything less than obviously crack seal and chip sealing. So we do cover, like, one of the things that we asked the board last year from a capital investment was like an asphalt roller and trailer. So we can significantly reduce the any future capital asked by doing that stuff in-house. And and the public works team has done 2 to 3 times more sidewalk and things than they had in the past because we have that piece of equipment, which is absolutely awesome. From other maintenance perspective, the only thing that we're borrowing for would be like I would say like the mill and overlay is the big thing. I would say one alternative, and it's not a popular alternative, and we started to look into this again to prepare for any possible need for additional revenue in the future, was wheel tax. I mean, and so what that would allow us to do is generate a collection, and again, call it a property taxes, call it wheel tax, I call it the cost of living in the village. But having that designated source of revenue would reduce any need for, some need for borrowing for those improvements. Grants are always a big one. Kyla was able to get the LRIP program for 2 or 3 of the segments of roads that are going to be in 2028. We've really, over the last couple of years, kind of established more finite, these are the projects we're going to do, which has allowed us to do some additional grant funding, which reminds me, we should be getting roughly between $200,000 and $350,000 of grant revenue from the solar project and the geothermal and the police station to offset future borrowing in this plan. That's not factored in to this plan, that revenue source, but I have a note, I'll note down to add it for village board. One thing I always get to is like, are there like sustainable features and other things we can do in our buildings to reduce Alliant costs, or just costs in general? And so typically, like we've done that when we did the SCADA project, we did that a lot on our well and lift station, put a lot of that kind of smart technology. We don't have a formal plan to address kind of other things, but there's definitely opportunities. You know, Village Hall is now almost a little over 30 years old. MSB was retrofitted back in 2015, 2016. So like there's definitely aging. When we're going to look at the cost of running, let's say the new police station compared to our existing facilities, those facilities are going to run much more efficient. I would say designate, if the committee or village board wanted to designate, fund balance to routine, like let's just say any dollar over a certain dollar amount automatically is gone to doing road maintenance or some type of preventative maintenance. That would also be a solution.
Thank you. I also have a question on page 10. We're talking about the general fund. So can you identify what portion of the departmental increases are like contractual, inflationary, or is there a portion that represents new spending or increased service levels?
Yes. This budget, to my knowledge, has no increased service levels. So if we're looking kind of at our big ticket items, insurance is obviously always a big one. So because of the appreciation of equipment, vehicles, that always carries a bigger increase. As I kind of mentioned, like for EMS, for example, 80,000 we're getting the same 24/7, 365 coverage, but we're seeing an estimated $80,000 increase in our allocation for EMS. I'm trying to think of other ones that kind of stand out. We have less elections next year, so there's a moderate decrease in election spending because obviously we don't have the number of elections in odd years. So like if I kind of looked at it from a percentage perspective, the PD budget roughly a 6% increase, fire roughly 8% increase, And again, those are conservative numbers. And then EMS is about 11.92% increase. We have general government is roughly 6.54%, but that's because some of that increase relates to the operations budget for the additional facilities. So when I'm kind of jumping forward to September department meetings and committees, there's, to my knowledge, no increased service levels being considered outside of possibly considering weekly recycling or recycling dumpster pickup.
Okay.
So there are a couple of things you want us to consider. I had Fireman's Park written down.
Yep, so Fireman's Park, that's a board request, and I know we have 3 board members here, but the board had asked to bring cost information forward. And so that number will come back to village board for possible addition back into the plan.
And that's for 2027.
Could be 27, could be 28.
Okay.
Again, we want to get this right. So there's some short-term things that we could do that might cost a little bit, but I think from my conversations with the fire department, and then some of the neighbors that live over here, is we only want to make the amount of pavement that we need. Mm-hmm. So having a strong understanding and not making any assumptions. Like, I don't want to say in a public meeting, we can get away with 9 feet width and we'd be completely fine. So wanting to make sure that we get that right before kind of moving forward. I do think there's some benefit. We've talked, and Sean should be bringing it forward, talking about doing a master planning for Fireman's Park. Mm-hmm. And that's to get kind of those 3 stakeholders involved on what they want that future of that park to look like.
So it probably makes sense to do that 2027 and then potentially move forward with something in 28.
Yeah, I think preliminarily when Kyla and Sean and I talked about it, there could be a kind of a shorter term, let's go get the really, really bad areas this year, and then long term, like a systemic possible correction in 2028.
Okay. Community park shelter, is that another one that I wrote it down.
I think when we take a step back from a policy perspective, we obviously understand that we can't have everything we want in a budget. And so I think understanding that it's in the budget right now, we know something needs to be done, period. Something has to be done. Is this full reconstruction exactly what needs to be done? Maybe not. Maybe there's ADA bathrooms are just adjusted and we take chunks of it, kind of similar to what we're doing in Fireman's Park. But those are the kind of really tough decisions here, because we obviously want everything, but there's obviously a tax impact.
Yeah, Paula.
My inclination is just, let's get the bathrooms done, right? Let's figure out a way. When I'm going there to play pickleball, I don't see people using the shelter very often. But I definitely think just, even if we can just tear the whole thing down and just build some nice bathrooms, I think that would be plenty.
And then I had a note about fire and EMS as well.
At this point in time, I don't feel comfortable with putting a specific year. I think as we kind of have discussion, I think when we're looking at things from a pure financial perspective, there's times when it makes sense to do it, but that shouldn't, obviously, from an emergency service perspective, that shouldn't supersede an actual emergency need. So when we talked about this with the last couple of years with our EMS and fire, it felt like it was a need, but it wasn't a super urgent need. So we had kind of tentatively put it into 2031 as a nice kind of parking spot. Mm-hmm. And we know this is a need, and we're going to put it in the plan so we can address it. That was a full substation. What I think is being recommended in draft form, which is obviously subject to discussions, is a much more modest addition. And so it might not be as significant.
Well, I think there could potentially be a two-part, like a renovation plus something, in well, probably most likely well off into the future. But it's helpful to know if 2029 is like a good financial year, if we could slide that, but also give that feedback while we're doing the study, I think, just to align things a little bit better.
Yep, I mean, I completely agree, and I think,
And I think there's preliminary numbers too, I mean, in the draft form.
yep.
So.
So are we just talking about capital things here and the impact? I mean, or are we gonna talk about any operational guidance or
Both.
both? All right, so I guess the question that I have relating to fire and EMS, well, fire particularly, is if we're going to have more operational expenses due to, full-time staff needs, that's kind of to be determined because the study's ongoing, haven't really decided anything yet. Are there we have a larger levy availability this year, so I would hate to put off other staffing that we need and then have all of it have to hit in the same year in like 2 years. So, I know the police department's been talking about a community liaison officer, looking at like how our public works staffing's doing, if we think we're gonna, just so we can kind of even out that operational expenses over time.
So I think what's most helpful here, because this body will see a draft budget too, is, when justifying any potential new positions that may be recommended, what would you expect a draft budget justification to look like? So like if we're talking, and even if that maybe includes maybe out 3 years, what that, again, high level, what are we anticipating? From a tax rate perspective, it's kind of a fine balance. So like how we've managed this in the past is maybe the hire is not a January 1 hire, maybe the hire is a July 31st, and then you can spread it over 2 years. With public safety being such a high priority over the last decade, those are typically the positions in a recommended budget that get filled. So there may be then a compromise for, let's say we didn't hire a public works or a park position, like could we stomach a part-time position or some type of other partnership?
Yeah, and then there's the utility also. Just talking last night about the capacity of the utility staff, so if you have a part public works, part utility staff too, that's separate also. So yeah, having those conversations within the context of what our levy limit is and what the tax impact is, I guess.
And I think last year, for each department, at the very bottom of everyone's justification, they had like future hiring requests coming down the pipelines. I think that's something that could be updated for everyone again.
Yeah, we don't want to kick everything down the road, so I think that's important to see like what's coming for each department and weigh how that looks.
Is there anything you want us to talk about in particular and give feedback on, Cameron?
I think everything's open for discussion. From a specific perspective, any recommendation obviously then would go to the village board for consideration, and just emphasizing this is kind of a rubric for what we'll bring forward in a draft. So I'm not saying I necessarily would, but bringing forward a $8 million levy would technically be concurrent to this guide, but the tax impact may not be stomachable. One of the things I am working on and working with our partners, and again, I hate doing this, projecting other taxing jurisdictions' tax rate, but refreshing for the community what our updated tax rate would be. based off of kind of what are known factors and other known factors. So there's a lot of homework that is done to get, especially because the information literally just got released from an equalized value perspective. But I think that's also helpful in the picture of board discussion is where are we going to end up overall?
Yeah, and when we talk about the revaluation, TID 5 closure, and then the net new construction with the levy, like that's a lot of factors at play all in one year that we really haven't had that many things all at once. So trying to communicate to residents like what all of that means, December 31st, tax bill time, I think is going to come up a lot in the next couple months.
And in a normal year, the assessed value is kind of finalized in like May. And then there's a lot of less moving pieces. We get the last piece of tax information on November 15th. That's the due date for when school districts provide me with what they're planning on levying. That's another huge wild card. Again, I'm a municipal kind of finance expert, so when we're taking now and stepping into a school district perspective, what is the impact on their generalized aid of the additional incremental value that's added? What does their per pupil amount look like? What other aids are they getting? So there's a lot of, even in what I'm estimating, going to be some high level of estimation. So there'll be an updated estimate, but knowing that I'm using what I can.
Cameron, when's the last time the staff went through like a zero-based budget challenge? It's not something you obviously do every year, but just really kind of looking back from scratch, seeing where we can lean things out. I mean, has that been done in recent years?
Yep. So I view zero-based budgeting two ways. So there's bringing forward a 0% increase budget that hasn't been directed through the FMP process. Every year, though, I'm a strong proponent that every year, every department starts off with a zero budget, and you need to add in, because it forces you to think about each individual expense that makes up your budget, and while that might be frustrating to people, I think it's important to see for like operational efficiencies. So like you find stuff like maybe a promotional discount ran out on internet, so we can save a couple $100 on internet, a couple $100 on cleaning services, things like that we kind of go through. It also forces, like, if we all of a sudden somebody tells us they're going to have a 10% increase in what our contract revenue is for them, we start those conversations then in August saying, hey, wait a second, is this one justified? And if it's not, it gives us some time to look for alternative solutions. I guess I can't force EMS and fire or other ones that aren't in our purview, but anything that the village budgets for zero-based. If you're talking about from a departmental 0% increase budget, I think the general fund is very significantly personnel-based. My worry there would be staff recommending obviously a budget forward that maintains personnel, but then decreases service levels indirectly, because unfortunately then that's where the operating costs suffer. So like the things that you need to actually provide services is no longer there. I think certain committees dive into it differently. So like salt, for example, I'll give that perfect example. They came forward with a better brine and salt distribution. So we decreased the amount of salt that we were putting down, like 50 to 60 tons. And so that's where I kind of look at the best efficiencies on if what we're doing is the most efficient operation.
Yeah, I think that's good. I just think, there's creative ways to be able to challenge staff to find efficiencies. Like, one of the things we're doing at my workplace is a 10% reduction in paper. right? I mean, obviously we're a much larger organization, but so it's sustainable, but it's also having an impact. And so, perhaps through the Public Works Sustainability Committee, what are some sustainable efforts that also have direct impacts? But I think just looking to each of the departments to trying to find efficiencies. We haven't talked much about the use of AI and helping reduce staff time or just again increasing efficiency. But I think it's something that corporations are doing. So I think it's a conversation that should be had by municipalities as well.
I would agree that we should always look for operational efficiencies, and I really like that salt usage because it has both the more efficient and a better outcome for the environment. So I think that is a really great example of efficiencies. I think one of the challenges that I think about compared to some corporate models is where a service-based entity. So plowing roads and, the types of activities that we do. Well, I think it's good to always look through all of our items to find where we can become more efficient. I think just that we're kind of all personnel-based makes that really somewhat of a challenge that we would reduce service levels if, those personnel costs stay the same because we have increasing health insurance costs and benefit costs. So then, that would kind of equate to fewer people doing the work. So I think that's somewhat of a challenge that I see in how we'd implement that.
I think we're pretty.
Yeah, and to clarify, I wasn't suggesting we reduce staff. So just want to clarify that.
Cameron, were there other things that you're looking for feedback on from us?
I would say, because this is the first time a tax impact is put on paper for the capital projects, again, moving this forward, recommendation from this body is saying, if we move forward, we're comfortable moving forward with all of these capital projects, including their tax impact. So I know we've had some conversations about community park. I know we've had, obviously, some conversations about Fireman's Park. We've talked about if this board wants to find other revenue sources. So really ongoing revenue sources that staff are looking for is grants and things that we would not just voluntarily bring forward as a wheel tax or an impact fee without kind of general direction from the board on future items. So obviously you're seeing all the projects in the model shown as general obligation debt, but if there's something that, hey, maybe is there a way that we can fund this differently in the future, that feedback, yeah.
I'm not interested in the wheel tax. If that's helpful feedback. I'm interested, and I'm in the minority too when it comes to the projects of moving community park further out. I want to see EMS, fire EMS renovations moved up, and then knowing that the police will be moving into their new home next year. I'd like to see effort put into remodel of MSB or restructuring so that we can fit future staffing in there and future programming space and that kind of thing. And so I don't know if that isn't in I would like to see it be a study next year with some type of implementation in 2028. And I think there's probably a lot of opportunity if we're looking at making that future public space too, that there are grant opportunities. I looked into some of the federal grants that we had done for the library in the past, and kind of opening up to, for that type of funding too. I think that could be definitely part of the conversation for some of that forward-facing space. But then looking for future operational space and staffing space, I think is important to do right away.
Yeah, I think that would be a good addition. And, the community park shelter, it's also it's come from a lot of different angles as this structure is going to fall down to maybe we need to think about what our ADA goals are there. So I think really getting a grip on if there is like actual pressing maintenance items that will make the facility like unusable versus like we're trying to meet ADA goals. So I think that hasn't been clear to me, like is there actually a structural problem that we'd have to close the facility versus like just we're trying to make it accessible. Like, so I feel like it's not clear.
Well, you've talked about master planning for Fireman's Park, and it's like, what do you do with the old park? What is the protocol for evaluating park renovations or shelter renovations as our parks begin to age? And I think maybe that's a larger conversation.
Yeah, it's similar. Yeah, exactly, for Fireman's Park, because a lot of our facilities are new enough that this is kind of the first time this is.
But evaluating who are the users, what are the immediate needs, what are the long-term needs, like how is the parks change over time? The community usage changes as more parks come online and people are going to different places, and so that might change how you are going to program spaces. And I think maybe having some type of policy protocol of how to reevaluate would inform future planning a little bit better than tear it down, build giant structure, or tear it down, put a bathroom, or fix different bits and pieces and patch it together, and I don't know. So.
Yeah, and
well,
yep.
I'm sorry. Has there been conversation to look to outside partners, that may want naming rights, for instance, for community park shelter, right? It could be the Amazon community park shelter, for instance, where we could just get creative and see if there are external funding resources so we don't have to keep pushing it back. It's just, that's a thought that crosses my mind.
I think you kind of touched too on a broader, as the community has grown, there's been certain situations where we're one time going to people for certain things. I think there's some utility on possibly coming up with a list of things maybe annually that we want to request of, community partners and say, hey, here's a list that we're trying to fund or fundraise for. So we're not constantly going back to the same provider. Hey, can we have $500? Hey, can we have $1,000? And I think it then to having the board give us direction as opposed to, us being like, oh, I know this person, asking for a certain initiative. I do think there should be conversation about unrestricted park development funds being utilized to offset this to some extent. I think that, in my opinion, is a no-brainer because obviously that it's replacing an existing but part of the reason that it's getting replaced is some of the ADA and technical stuff. So it's going to be built to serve the current community, not necessarily what its initial intended use was. So yeah, I mean, this is great feedback.
I think potentially even policy change within parks to create some type of foundation or something so that you have legacy funding to do special additions and projects makes a lot of sense, especially now that the community is a little bit more established.
Yeah, and even smaller things like benches and trees. I mean, there's a lot of different ads that can be in our park space that, donors of various levels might be interested in contributing to the community.
Aside from what I would like in the plan, I think I'm totally fine with moving this forward to village board, but what do others think?
I mean, no, it's good conversation.
Well, if there's no more discussion on it, we can consider a recommendation to the village board, including all of my asks. I'm just kidding. Majority. Can also, I mean, I can make a motion.
You kind of had a little bit of a list
Yeah,
that I
I-
may only have partially written down.
Make a motion to recommend the financial management, 2027 financial management plan to the village board, making a few adjustments to the CIP, moving the fire and EMS station renovations to 2029, using draft budget numbers, considering community park shelter using park development fees, with the recommendation that the park committee look to do some additional master planning and evaluation of what would be critically necessary for that shelter. And for Fireman's Park, again, kind of the direction of what needs to be done, what can be done internally this year or next year, but then looking to other entities and doing some master planning of what kind of future visioning would be for Fireman's Park, including hitting some of our sustainability goals. And the addition of a space study for MSB next year.
I would second that motion.
Any discussion on the motion? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries. Number 6.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion and a second, non-debatable, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you.